and I'll just minimize it so it's not too
intrusive.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's all right.
Yep. All right, so we'll start again. Yeah, hi, my name is Rabbi Barber, and the topic is contemporary halacha. But if you have any questions about anything, feel free to ask. I actually sit on the Melbourne Beth Din, and so what I thought I'd do is I would share with you some of questions that we've had lately and develop those ideas. If something I say, the Hebrew or a concept you don't quite get, put your hand, ask, or if you disagree, please. It's not a monologue. This is sort of like a discussion. Contemporary halacha. It's an interesting heading. Contemporary means that it's contemporary. It's something that is applicable today. On the other hand, halacha, our source of Judaism, goes back to Mount Sinai. And the challenge, of course, is that at Mount Sinai, they didn't have iPhones. And, well, I don't think they had iPhones 15 years ago either. So how does halacha then relate to something that is contemporary? Contemporary not just today, the 1800s or the 1500s. And if we speak about that the Torah is unchangeable, then what we need to do is we'll have to find concepts and ideas in halacha which go all the way back to Mount Sinai, which will be applicable in the world that we live in today. Okay. After that quick introduction, let me share with you a question, which is one of the most challenging questions that is facing Torah world today. The reason why it's one of the most challenging is because it's fairly recent, and since it's only fairly recent, rabbis are still trying to come to terms with the question and the various options which are available. Lady came to see me, see the Beth Din, and single woman in Australia. She tried for a number of years to become pregnant through IVF. She was unsuccessful, and adoption really wasn't an option. It's very difficult in Australia to adopt, especially if you're a single parent. Usually, if that's the case, you would be given a child that is somewhat challenging, which is counterintuitive. If you're a single parent, it makes life even more difficult, especially if you've got a child that is somewhat challenging. You're only one parent. And she saw the only option that she had was the concept of surrogacy. Now, surrogacy is illegal in Australia, but in certain states in the United States it isn't. So she actually went to America, and it was interesting, just the whole process, psychological testing and all other testings that she had to do before they were willing to allow her to enter the program. But they did eventually. And there are different levels of surrogacy. Now, of course, the sperm came from a Jewish individual. For whatever reason, she felt that she wanted to have the sperm that came from a Jewish man. We'll soon see that probably that is problematic in the sense that if given a choice, she should have chosen one that came from somebody who wasn't Jewish. But we'll come back to that soon. And sometimes you can have a situation where the woman is able to donate her eggs, but she's unable to carry. And then her eggs are then placed within the woman who's going to carry the child. But in this particular instance, because of her age, she was unable to give her eggs to be create a viable fetus. And so there was an egg donor, and there was also a woman who carried the child. The egg donor, primarily they do it for financial reasons. It can cost anywhere between 20 and 30,000. However, the person who carries the child, they don't usually do it for monetary reasons. Usually they've already had a child, That's usually what they want. And they just do it for a noble cause. There are, of course, challenges in terms of insurance, to take out insurance and the like, but she overcame all of these issues, and she actually, well, as she calls it, she created her child, a daughter, and the daughter's now 2 years old. You know, she, all different, you know, college degree, and so on, all these various things that she could tick the boxes on to create this child. The question she now had was the status of this child in terms of Jewishness. She wants the child to be Jewish. She's extremely secular, but Jewish nonetheless. And what is the status of the child? Now, the fact that the father happened to be Jewish is irrelevant, because we know, according to Jewish law, we don't follow the father. It's not paternal, it's rather maternal, that will define the status of the child. Now, the reason why I mentioned earlier that it would have been, from a halachic perspective, better to have a donor who's not Jewish, because theoretically, well, put it this way, in the United States, or in this state anyway, you can refuse the offspring to discover who was the sperm donor. And there is a cost that the person receives, very minimal, $100, $150. In Australia, however, the law is that in this situation you can't charge, and the offspring can find out who in fact was the donor. So if we have a Jewish man who donated sperm, it could very well be that he's donated hundreds of times. Therefore, to a certain extent, there could be hundreds of children running around who all have the same biological father. This, of course, could create challenges and questions about when this child grows up, and this child then marries or wants to marry somebody. Who are they actually marrying? And are they related at all to this individual? And what's interesting is, when I was talking to her, I said, you know, just out of interest, I was saying, put aside religion, just Judaism. I just said it's interesting that there is no a legal process that ensures that this doesn't eventuate. You could argue, look, in America, they were speaking about how many hundreds of millions of people, the likelihood is very, very minimal. But in theory, if you speak about, let's say, a small area of the United States where this person donated a lot of sperm and people lived in the same town, so to speak, and grew up, it could be possible. Anyway, but I didn't make mention of that to her. The question we now have is the status of the child. Now, the obvious answer is that the child is definitely not Jewish, because there is nothing about that child that should say that the child is Jewish.
The mother's eggs, no?
Well, we said over here the egg donor, the mother, the woman who's now raising this child, she considers herself to be the mother. She wasn't the egg donor. Now, of course,
she just adopted the kid?
Sorry?
So to speak.
She just adopted it?
Surrogacy. Well, in a sense, she adopted, but she created the child.
So
She ordered the child.
She didn't.
No, she was somebody who donated the egg. It was an egg donor. It was one woman, and another woman actually carried the
Wasn't
fetus
the same
to
one.
term. Wasn't the same. Usually, it's not the same.
Okay. And then the one that carried the baby gave it back to someone else.
Yes, gave it back. Gave it to this particular woman.
Okay.
This woman from Australia. Yeah. I always say when somebody comes to the Bezdin, they don't come for a cup of coffee. Because it's very emotional. Now over here, so what we have over here, we have a woman who was desperate, and rightfully so, to be able to have motherhood, so to speak. And the only option that she had was going down this path. So to speak in terms of that there is no connection, well, of course there is. Biologically, there is no connection. But one has to be very, very careful how one phrases one's response and being sensitive to the needs of this particular woman. Now let's step back for a moment and let's consider a situation where, and this also happens, that either the egg donor happened to be a Jewish woman, or the woman carrying the child happened to be Jewish, or you could have a situation where, let's say this woman, the woman who's now raising the child, she donated her own eggs, didn't actually come from another woman who was Jewish, or perhaps she couldn't use her own eggs and she had eggs placed within her, and she carried the child, but the eggs were from another woman. The question which we have to ask ourselves, and that is, how do you define life? How do you define the individual? Now, the eggs, of course, they are the DNA of the person. That's one approach of looking at it. And you could argue and you could say that the woman who's carrying the child is nothing more than an oven. That's where the child forms. Look, I don't know if I don't think I have to go too far on a limb to make the following statement. I honestly believe that there will come a time that we will have children born on planet Earth that were never in a womb at all. You will simply have the egg and the sperm, and they will kind of join together, and then they will be placed in this incredible incubator, and you can actually watch as your child it forms. Now you could think this is sort of like science fiction, but that's what they probably said about a lot of things that we experience. I mean, just on a side point, we know that we've advanced incredibly in terms of the ability to save the life of a fetus. Even tiny little babies have managed to survive through the incubator. From halachic perspective, we consider the child to be born the moment that it leaves its mother's womb. The fact that it cannot survive without being in the incubator, and it spends a considerable amount of time in the incubator, that doesn't take away from the fact that it's considered born. In other words, its birth date and so on and so forth will be on the day that it actually came into, so to speak, the earthly atmosphere. But getting back to our question, so the question is, how do we define motherhood? That's one approach, is to say, well, let's look at the woman who donated the eggs. Another approach is that doesn't make much sense, because, as one rabbi put it, in theory then, if the woman who donated the eggs is considered to be the mother, she could possibly be sitting on the beach in Florida while a woman is in labor in New York giving birth, and she will be considered the mother sitting on the beach in Florida because she was the egg donor. Now, both rabbis, both set schools of rabbis, bring various sources to their positions. One of the sources that they bring is something I'm sure you're all familiar with, and that is the story brought down in the oral literature, Torah Sheba'al Peh, and that was a situation with Leah and Rachel. You know that Yaakov had 4 wives. He had 2 main wives, and then 2, if you call them secondary if you want. And Rachel had 1 son, Yosef. She then discovered she was pregnant, which was wonderful. And Leah also discovered that she was pregnant. Now, by that time already, the 2 midwives already had 2 sons each. They were part of the 12 tribes. Now, somehow, Leah discovered, probably through divine inspiration, that she was carrying a boy and Rachel was carrying a girl. What that would mean is that her sister would only have 1 tribe to her name, 1 boy and 1 girl. And she would have an extra tribe, and the midwives would have 2 each. So in a sense, Rachel would be inferior. So she prayed to God, and somewhat of a miracle occurred. And the fetus, they were swapped over. And Rachel, who was carrying Leah, then received Benjamin, and vice versa. And for argument's sake, what we always say is that Rachel is the mother of Benjamin, and Leah is the mother of Dinah. Now, in this case, the egg donor of Dinah was Leah. The egg donor of Rachel, no, I'm sorry, the other way around. The egg donor of Dinah was Rachel. The egg donor of Benjamin was Leah.
The transactions meant like nothing actually physically happened.
Okay, so
You're talking about egg donor, like an egg physically being put into another lady. Nothing. They didn't physically change the egg donor.
okay.
Or fetuses.
Well,
It's a
seemingly,
concept.
yeah. Okay. So we have this medrash. This is what the medrash says. That this is what happened. How it happened, I don't know. Miraculously or whatever. One rabbi said, "We are so desperate for source material. We'll use this as a source material." Other rabbis feel that, as we know, the halacha is that we cannot really bring halachic proof from stories that are related in the medrash. Midrashic literature, there is in itself an argument whether we should take it literally or whether we should view it at times nothing more than homiletic and just it's to teach us a message or something, but not that it actually did take place. Right? So there are
And Gemara in general?
No, it depends. Well, we're talking about the stories in the Talmud. When we speak about, for example, the Medrash says that Pharaoh was a midget who was, let's say, 3 feet tall. Now, one approach is, well, he was a short fellow. Another approach is, no, he could have been regular height, but spiritually he was a midget, and therefore he's referred to as being a midget. I'll give you an example just to explain it if we go on a tangent for a moment. In pre-war Poland, a very famous Jewish city was called Dvinsk. And in Dvinsk, there were the 2 of the greatest rabbis of the generation. One was called Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk. He wrote a commentary called the Meshech Chochmah of Dor Samech. He was the Lithuanian rabbi of the city. And then there was the Rogatchover Gaon, Rabbi Yosef Rosen, who was the Chassidish Rav, who was giants among the giants, a chassid of the Rebbe Rashab. And one morning after shul, a group of members of the community are sitting around and they're talking, who's bigger? Who's bigger? Is the Or Sameach bigger? Or is the Softness Paneach, is known the Rogatchover, who's bigger? And one guy comes in, here's a discussion, he walks and says, I don't know what you guys are arguing about. It's very simple, very simple. Well, next time they... And they said, no, you don't understand. We weren't talking about, when we said bigger, we weren't talking about bigger in terms of height, we were talking about bigger in terms of greatness. So similarly, when we have these episodes related in the Talmud, not necessarily do we take the words with one particular meaning, we perhaps look at another interpretation, but that's just by the way. So the other rabbis said, well, we can't take this, use this for such halachic serious consequences if it's based on perhaps a homiletic understanding. So what do we do? Because these questions are real. These questions are happening all the time. So the answer which we give is to the individual or the couple is that the jury is still out. Meaning to say, there is not one school of thought that has given enough evidence and swayed the other school of thought that everyone is now in agreement that this is the correct halachic rule. It is evolving. It may never evolve, but it is evolving at the moment. So one school of thought says, we'll look at the woman who donated the eggs. If she was Jewish, the child is Jewish. The other school of thought says, no, we'll look at the one who actually gave birth to the child. If she was Jewish, then the child is Jewish.
Do they look at any other sources in the Torah?
Yeah, there are, but it's too complicated, and I want to move on to some other ideas. I just wanted to give a concept. And the since the school is out, what we say is we're not really 100% sure. So what we say to the couple, or to the mother, to the woman, more than likely you're the mother. Let's just say, very often we'll have a case where she carried the child or she donated the eggs. You know, there are so many opinions who agree and feel that you are the mother. And that's what she wants to hear. She wants to hear that she's the mother. However, there is some schools of thought who learn differently, who have a slightly different approach, to be on the safe side, in order that when your child grows up, the child should have no question about their Judaism, their Jewishness. What we suggest is, what we encourage is, that the child will go through a conversion which is based, when Hebrews call it safek, we're not quite sure, we're not 100% sure, and therefore we go through it. In this particular instance, however,
Is it against Torah what she did?
no, 1 second. In this particular instance, there is nothing to say, okay, there is a school of thought that equates your child to be Jewish. The child, without doubt, must undergo a conversion process. Okay? Now, the question which was raised was, is this process against halacha and so on?
What would it be against?
Sorry?
What would it be against?
I don't know.
Because
Okay, let me just tell you a rule of thumb, just talking about contemporary halacha and how we decide halachic questions. One of my teachers, many years ago, his approach to deciding halachic questioning was as follows. There's two ways of doing something. You can say everything is permitted, prove to me why it's prohibited. Everything is prohibited and prove to me why it's permitted.
mm,
His approach always was, everything is permitted. Now you tell me why it's prohibited. Chazar pig? Why not? Tell me why it's prohibited. The Torah says so. So it really depends which approach you come from. So, but of course that doesn't mean that you're lenient and you permit things which are contrary to halacha, but it's a mindset of how you view things. And there are, of course, many different questions in this area. IVF, surrogacy, and so on and so forth. And all of them have to be juggled and all of them have to be dealt with. But if you can tick all the boxes, then it shouldn't really be a halachic issue or a halachic concern.
Is there anything against intervening with God's natural way?
Well, in actual fact, it's interesting. One could argue and say that Ramban dealt with this question. There is a school of thought, I don't know if you're familiar with this, there are those who have a certain belief that they don't seek medical intervention.
Mm.
The logic being, if God made you sick, then God will make you better. Right? So who are you to intervene? Now what's interesting is, Ramban says that perhaps could have been the Jewish approach. Because the Torah, we have a verse in the Torah says, V'rapo yarapeh, and you shall surely heal. Why the double expression? To which we respond, from here permission is granted to the doctor that he is allowed to heal. Implying that perhaps if permission wasn't given, then perhaps we are not permitted to intervene. But halacha says that we are obligated. But just going back to your question is, modern medicine and all advancements need to be used for the benefit of mankind. So therefore, anything that a person can do to create life, prolong life, improve the quality of life, then one should strive to do so. The questions will come about when we have a conflict, for example, on Shabbat, desecration of Shabbat, and we're dealing with medical procedures that may not be considered, if you want to use Western medical practice, but more things that don't seem to follow any logical or medically proven processes, whether that would be permitted. But generally speaking, we permit anything and everything, besides, of course, transgressing the three cardinal transgressions. Okay. So it was one question that I had to deal with this week. Another issue which I had to deal with this week Totally different cup of tea, but one which is very relevant and prevalent in the Jewish world today. And that word is aguna. Okay, aguna means chained. Let me just give you a little bit of brief history, a little bit of background. The concept of the aguna is not something new. It goes back to the beginning of time, so to speak, but it's taken on a totally different understanding the world we live in today. In the times of old, the aguna was a situation, more often than not, where the husband had simply disappeared, and we couldn't find him. Right? Now, when I say it goes all the way back, honestly, that is not true from a historical perspective. And let me explain why. The concept of marriage and divorce, or divorce, is something fairly new. It's a fairly recent phenomenon. And for many, many hundreds of years, especially in Europe, the governments of the time were extremely happy to allow the Jews to worry about themselves when it came to aspects of marriage and divorce. And therefore, if a person wanted to get married, he went to the rabbi. If a person wanted to get divorced, he went to the rabbi. If you wanted to remarry, you had to go to the rabbi. So in order to remarry, you needed to get a divorce, and to get a divorce, you only could get it from the rabbi. So that in itself was encouragement enough to ensure that people went to the rabbi, to the Beth Din, to get a divorce, because that's the only way they could remarry. Later on in time, we speak about the idea of divorce. Now, for example, the church, to this day, there are certain elements of the church that don't condone divorce. What they do is they speak about annulment of marriage, but they don't actually commit divorce per se. So for a lengthy period of time, the idea of the aguna, in terms of the man disappearing, wasn't that common, because if you wanted to remarry, you would need the rabbi's permission. And also, don't forget, in times of old, for hundreds of years, Jews were born into the shtetl, grew up in the shtetl, married in the shtetl, had children in the shtetl, and died in the shtetl. They didn't really travel. If they traveled 5 or 6 kilometers or 10 kilometers, this was sort of like a big trip. You know, like my mother grew up here in Melbourne. She said going to Frankston was like, wow, this is incredible. You know, or my uncle who in Poland, he told us that, you know, if they would go on the train and they would go visit an uncle who lived 2 kilometers away, this was sort of like, wow, what a trip. But we live in a totally different world as we did then. So Jews didn't really travel that much, so it was hard to disappear. The issue of aguna of old came primarily when Jews went to war. It goes all the way back to times of King David, and then during the First World War or other wars that Jews were conscripted in, and where they didn't return, and then the question was, you know, what do we do now? This, of course, became very problematic at the conclusion of the Second World War, where people were looking for partners. And they were married and they weren't sure if the person was alive. And to resolve the question of whether a person is single or is still married, this question is from the most challenging and the most difficult. And these questions can only be answered by the greatest of the greatest rabbis of any specific generation. Because the catastrophic outcome that can result when you grant permission to say that somebody is in fact single, when in fact they're not, especially for a woman, is truly devastating. What I mean, and for example, I was actually part of a tragic case going back a number of years. Case that began after the war in Poland. Woman, she had a son, and she had no idea what happened to her husband. Went to the rabbis at the time, and they came up with the ruling to say that her husband had perished. Obviously, there was some form of testimony that they accepted. She then moved to Israel, remarried, some children, and the son that survived the war with her, once he reached an age of 18, 19, she wanted him to get a job, profession, and she thought that he's good with his hands, perhaps become a car mechanic. Not far from where she lived, there happened to be a garage, a car mechanic, and she took her son there, that perhaps he can get a job there as an apprentice. When she walked in and she saw the man there, she nearly fainted because that man was her first husband. He had never remarried after the war. And when he saw this was his son and this was his wife, it affected, of course, as you can imagine, how it impacted everyone. He then moved to Australia, other end of the world. He moved out, not part of the Jewish community at all. Eventually, that son migrated to Australia to be with him. And he died, a lonely man. And at his funeral, I didn't make mention of it, the story, but I just said, people think that the Holocaust finished so many years ago, but in fact, for many, it has continued to this very day, as it was then. So that's the great danger. And that was the scenario that rabbis dealt with. In more recent times, the only time that this question has really come to fore was a situation quite a number of years ago, when there was the Israeli Navy, a submarine sunk, and all of its members perished, not to be found. In the more recent times was the tragedy of September 11th, where there were tragically many Jewish individuals who lost their lives. And again, the rabbis had to come up with ways of allowing spouses to remarry, specifically the women. What then does the word agunah mean today? The word agunah means what we refer to as a living agunah. It's where either the man or the woman knows where their spouse, or hopefully soon to be ex, and the other party refuses to cooperate in the giving or the receiving of the get. Now, usually people speak about the agunah as a woman's issue, so to speak. More often than not, that probably is the case. But from my own experience in Melbourne, we have probably an equal amount of cases where the man wants to go through with the divorce, but the woman refuses. She does not want to receive the divorce. According to the Torah, a man is allowed to divorce his wife whether she's in agreement or not. That was the rule of the Torah. However, Rabbeinu Gershom, who lived about 1,000 years ago, he introduced many laws. He introduced the law that a man shouldn't have more than one wife. Another law he introduced was that you cannot divorce a woman against her will. So basically, the woman also has power, certain power over a man, that if she refuses to accept the divorce, he cannot remarry. Now, in all honesty, that isn't exactly the case, because as we said, according to the Torah, a man can have more than one wife. And there is a loophole, not a loophole, there is an option, but it's not an easy option. And that is if the rabbis feel that this woman who's refusing to receive the divorce is totally being unreasonable, and she is already living a life that is not befitting a woman who is halachically still a married woman. It's what we refer to as hetemei rabbonim, that again, it's a concept and a lengthy procedure where you need 100 rabbis to sign that they allow the man to remarry. He doesn't divorce his wife. You can write a divorce, and if she accepts it, that's great. But otherwise, he ends up having two wives, okay? Which sometimes the second wife isn't all that pleased to know that in theory there is another wife, and that makes it a little bit also difficult then, for the husband to go through with it. But we have an equal amount of cases. And more often than not, you'll get the question that people ask, contemporary halacha, why don't we adapt? Why don't we change things? Why don't we make it easier? For example, in Australia, well, in Victoria anyway, you have to be separated from your partner at least for a year. But once a year has passed, then you are automatically, and you've applied for divorce, you're automatically divorced, whether both parties are in agreement or not. That's just the law. So why can't we have something like that in Judaism? It's a good question. The answer which I like to give is as follows. The answer I like to give is that the rabbis are, if you want to give them a name, they would be the referee. They're the ones who are given the rule book and they say, okay, go out and now umpire this football match, umpire this baseball game. So all they have is they have the rule book, they interpret the rule book. It's usually pretty clear. There could be some room for, movement, a little bit here, a little bit there, but generally it's pretty straightforward. 3 strikes and you're out. They can't all of a sudden say, okay, you know what, we'll give you an extra strike, or, we'll take away 1 ball from you. You don't have to run all 3 bases, just run to the first base and it's considered a home run. Yeah, you could, but that wouldn't be called baseball anymore. That would have to be a new game. Likewise, the rabbis were given this rule book. The one who actually wrote the rule book are the ones who created baseball. Now, since baseball was created by man, so you can have a situation where whatever the body is called, they can change the rules. Just like many sports, to make it more attractive, make it more user-friendly, to create more people, in a sense to create more people, but get more people interested in coming to the game, they may change some of the rules. But they won't change it that much to the extent that, you watch it 20 years later and you say, what sport is this? It'll be similar. You'll still know, okay, this is baseball. A little bit different, but more or less the same, but changed nonetheless. The beauty, and I say the word beauty because the beauty of the Torah is that it is from Sinai. It's from God. And why I say that's the beauty of that is, I'll tell you why I think so, anyway, my own personal opinion. And that is that we live in a world today, well, in America, for example, same-sex marriage was now the High Court, Supreme Court of America, passed the bill. I honestly believe it'll happen in Australia in very short in the future. 30 years ago, it was considered illegal. Not that long ago, it was considered by the psychiatric Bible as being an illness. So you think to yourself, my position 30 years ago when it was illegal, and I agreed with that. So that was a moral position, morally correct. Now all of a sudden, 30 years later, that position, seemingly by my government, is considered to be an immoral position. So how am I to define my own sense of morality? How am I to define what I believe to be right and wrong? Yeah. When over a period of time during a person's own lifetime, things can change to such extremes, and it's very hard to know what's morally correct or not. However, if one lives a life based on the Torah, then moral code, ethical code doesn't change. It's exactly the same. The same attitude that we had towards homosexuality 30 years ago, 200 years ago, is the same we have today. It hasn't changed in the slightest. So Maimonides, Rambam writes, there is no greater joy than resolving doubt. I don't know if you experience in your own life, about anything in life. You're not sure about something, you don't know what to do, and then you come to a decision, maybe the wrong decision, but at least you come to a decision. So you feel a little bit more calm, you feel a little bit more relaxed. That's what Maimonides says, Rambam says that. So clarity. If you, sorry? Clarity. So the same thing is, if you live in a world that you're not really sure about anything, you don't know where are the goalposts, you're not sure what is right and what is wrong, and you are a thinking individual, it becomes very challenging. The beauty of the Torah is, I wake up today and I wake up in 50 years' time, please God, or somebody woke up 200 years ago, we're all on the same page. Moshe Rabbeinu would walk into this room here right now, we could talk to him, we could discuss with him. So many things, moral issues, ethical issues, and we would be in agreement. Nothing will have changed. The qualities that Avram Avinu, being hospitable and kind. We'll tell him, what are you talking about? We live the same way today as well. So that becomes the dilemma, the challenge that we face. Of course, we do whatever we possibly can to alleviate, and we try to ensure that couples do the right thing and give and receive a divorce. And most rabbis, most Beth Dins will bend over backwards, as we do, to do whatever we can to reach that situation. And but sometimes it is challenging, but that's what we try and do. So that's the modern day aguna. There are certain things, for example, in Victoria anyway, there is a clause that you can put into your civil divorce, which will encourage the other spouse to come and participate in the process of the Beth Din. You see, because the issue which we have is that you cannot force somebody to give a divorce in most cases. You can encourage, you can say it's the right thing to do, you can even say you must do it. But I can tell people to do a lot of things, but that doesn't mean they're ever going to do it. But if we would live in a world where in Israel they do have that authority, they do use it. People can sit in prison if they refuse to give a divorce. They can lose their driver's license. They can lose their passport. They lose a lot of their freedom. But at the end of the day, you can sit in jail, and if you're not interested in giving a divorce, you just don't need to give one. It's as simple as that. So that's another area of contemporary halacha that is relevant. It's more applicable today than before because people travel a lot more. You know, you can be one day here and the next day you can be in the other part of the world. You can disappear a lot easier. It is true that with the internet and so on, it's one, you know, it's become a global village, but people are no longer, so to speak, living under the rule of one community. You know, in times of old, you grew up in a shtetl, and the rabbi said, you better give your wife a divorce. What's he going to do? He's not moving anywhere else. He's stuck there. The rabbi says, well, if you don't, I'll just tell everyone in the city and no one's going to come to your store and buy anything off you. The guy has no choice. He has to. Today we live in a big world. That's no problem. I'll move interstate. I'll go to another synagogue. I won't go to shul at all. How many Jews, shul is not a central aspect of their lives, but in times of old, even people who are not that observant, shul was still, you know, they didn't have nightclubs in the shtetl. They didn't have casinos. They didn't have bars. You know, and if they did, the Jews weren't allowed to come in anyway. So where did people socialize? They went to the shul to socialize. That was the place where people socialized. And if, you know, you weren't wanted, you weren't welcome, it really was challenging. And that was a strong influence on individuals. So that's what we see from over here is that the definition of the name has changed. The circumstances with which the question is dealt with has changed. The challenges have changed. But the parameters of the laws are exactly the same. It's how we deal with those laws that one needs to somehow find the correct mechanism, but the process will remain exactly the same. Okay. Any questions or any other issues before I move into the third and final? Any questions? No? Perfect. Okay. Okay. Another area which is probably equally as challenging in the Jewish world today. And the first question we spoke about was to define life, or not really when life begins, but you know, who is the identifiable individual as being the father or the mother, so to speak. The other major question that we have today is end of life, or how do we define when a person is no longer alive? And the reason why it is a question that has arisen today more than ever before, not just today, and let's talk about in the last short period of time, is because, again, because of modern medicine, people are, so to speak, kept alive a lot longer than they were ever possibly beforehand. And we now have what's called two schools of thought from a halachic perspective, and that is one school of thought, which was a traditional approach, which was the approach of medicine as well, that if there was a cessation of the functioning of the heart, which of course is responsible for a person's capacity and ability to breathe, if that stops, then the person has passed away. That's one approach. And in fact, that's how the Talmud and the Mishnah speaks about defining death. It speaks about, for example, on the Shabbat. You're not allowed to desecrate the Shabbat if somebody's passed away. But if somebody perhaps is still alive and you're not sure, then you do whatever you can to save that person's life. So therefore, if God forbid a wall structure falls and there are some people under it, then of course you will do whatever you can to remove the boulders and the bricks to try and save that person's life. But once you discover the person, and you tragically will discover that that person has passed away, then the halacha of how you then, next steps you take, will change because the person is no longer alive. And the question is, well, how do we define if that person is alive or not? How do we know if that person is alive or not? And the Mishnah and the Talmud speak about seeing if that person is breathing. Putting your ear close to the nostril, so to speak, to the mouth, and to see whether that person indeed is breathing. And that's how it was, because there was no other way of defining, of understanding. How else do you define life and death? However, with modern medicine, especially as time goes on, I'm sure it will improve, there was another new concept which was called brain death. Now, brain death is not really a good way of describing it. It's more brain stem death, where tragically the brain does not function, and the brain stem also doesn't function, meaning to say the electricity, for a better word, electricity that is transmitted from the brain and the brain cell stem does not then pass through to the rest of the body. And in a sense, you could say it's a person who's headless, because there is no brain. And that became another school of thought, and that, for many, was the definition of death. Now, why would people or modern medicine want to use that as the definition of defining life and death? The reason is very simple, because once the world, Christian Barnard was the first to do the heart transplant, but you can only do a heart transplant if the heart is still functioning. Once a heart ceases to function, you can't transplant it. So if a person is brain dead, he could still be breathing. He could still, because they work independently, his heart could still be functioning. And therefore I can do a transplant, or other vital organs, they're still functioning. If, however, I have to wait till the person is actually the cessation of breathing and heart function, so then there can never be a transplant. And the issue then became, well, what tests do I do to prove or to verify this? Now, what I'd just like to share with you, without going into all the details, because it's not really relevant, these questions, again, have to be answered by people who are well versed in these halachic issues. But what you will constantly find is where somebody is tragically could be in ICU, intensive care, or wherever, and usually they're old. And the doctors will speak about quality of life. That's a big thing today. Quality of life. Everyone wants. They need quality of life, which is an important thing. Just let them. We're not speaking about assisted suicide, which in some, in America, perhaps, they're euthanasia, assisted euthanasia, and the like. We don't have to even go down that path. But to what level of intervention will you permit and offer to the patient if, for example, they're tragically, or God forbid, in a comatose state or the like. All right. Now, let me share with you what happened. One of my members of my congregation many years ago was in such a state. And of course, hospitals aren't really that keen in having patients in that state taking up a bed, because they don't really think the person will recover, and they won't recover, and they need the bed for someone else. And therefore, they'll always call in the family, and they'll speak to the family about quality of life, and and so on and so forth, and they'll insist. I mean, every state has its own legal terms and rules and regulations. But anyway, they set up a meeting with the head of the ICU, myself and the family. And the doctor, very nice fellow, and the doctor comes in and he says to me, he says, "Look, you're a rabbi, right?" He says, "Jewish, right?" I said, "Yeah." So he says to me, "I don't understand." He says, "You guys believe in the afterlife?" I said, "Yep." He said, "Christians also believe in an afterlife. And whenever I have a Christian patient here, they're sad and whatever, but they're happy to let us allow the patient just to go. But the Jewish people, you do whatever you can to keep the person alive. I don't understand. If there's another world, why are you so insistent to keep the patient here? There's another world. It's not as if they disappeared. They just go to another world." Good question. Okay. So, asked for divine intervention. I don't know if I got it. This is the answer which I gave to the question which was posed. It's a good question. And there are many answers that one can give. One of the answers I gave was, we have to define what quality of life means. You see, Western civilization, its key word is rights. The rights. Everyone has rights. It's my right. Everything is your right. Okay, I'll just finish 1 second.
Sorry.
No, what time? 4 o'clock? 2 minutes? Oh, it's 4 o'clock already?
No, it's fine.
Judaism thinks about obligations, what we're obligated to, not what our rights are. Topic in its own right, and it totally changes. So a person who's in a comatose state, their rights, but they could still be fulfilling their obligations. What does that mean? I said very simple. This person is in this state, and but all the family are here together. All the family have come. There could be family members that haven't spoken to each other, and here they're seeing the mother here, and she's brought them all together. And as a result, they've joined together. And that's one approach. Another approach is, you're right, we believe in an afterlife, but a person has to be here for a certain period of time. We don't know. It could be that extra minute that a person is here, they need to be here for that period of time for whatever reason. So that's some of the answers you could give, but there are many other answers you could give. But on the one hand, we do whatever we can, but there is basis, even according to Jewish law, where one should pray and can pray for a person to pass away. If a person is in incredible pain, suffering greatly, and from a medical perspective, there is no medical hope. Of course, it's up to God. God can always perform a miracle, but till that occurs, you can in fact pray that the person should no longer be in suffering. I've got a great note to finish off, but we'll finish off here. Yeah. Okay.
Can I just ask you a question?
Yeah.
In terms of the organ transplants and brain dead and
Right.
everything, if you are living, when you are that, what is the halakhic opinion about organ transplants? It just depend on the person's situation.
Right. In other words, can you take an organ?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
Really?
You can. Yes. Yes.
You can donate organs?
Oh no. Well, that is an issue, but it's not the issue. Which question was, can you take an organ? Yeah. Your question is, how can you take it? Right, but because if you wouldn't take it, somebody else would take it. It's not as if you don't believe in brain death, it's a good, excellent question, the definition of death. So were you then causing the person's demise? The answer is no, because if not you, then somebody else would have it anyway. But that's a very good question. Yeah.
I thought you have to return the body.
to its state.
With everything.
That is true as well, but it's really a topic in its own right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Keep well.
Thank you very, very much.
Is it a charger?